I'll admit that there are some pretty big claims that are being made in the hemp realm that are not yet backed up by good data, really, when we talk about carbon sequestration. And I think what happens is when you walk out to a field of fiber hemp, it is a tremendous field of biomass, right? And so people say, wow, there's so much carbon being sequestered. Yes and no. Yes, if we were to leave that in the field as is, but we always have to remember that this crop is destined to go into a product, right? And so it's really critical that we have more life cycle analyses, meaning from cradle to grave, from my seeds all the way to whatever product I'm making, I have a good accounting for the carbon.
That's David Suchoff from North Carolina State University. This is the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. My name is Eric Herlock. Today we're going to hear my conversation with Dr. David Suchoff about his work at NC State, where he is an alternative crops extension specialist and assistant professor. He's one of the leaders in hemp at NC State and is also the director of the Hemp Research Consortium. We'll hear about all of that, plus we're going to talk about hemp in the southeastern United States and why the South has the reputation for textiles that it does. All that and more on today's show. First, we'll take a quick sponsor break and come back with a few nuggets of hemp news. Today's show is sponsored by IND Hemp in Fort Benton, Montana, where they believe in the goodness of hemp. So just the other day, I was talking to Ken Elliott from IND Hemp, and he was wondering if we could use this sponsor message here on the show to urge all of our listeners to go see the movie Common Ground. This is the sequel to Kiss the Ground that came out a few years ago. Common Ground is premiering around the country this month, and Ken really wants all of us to go see it. He says, and I quote, "Regenerative farming is a big part of the environmental solution, and hemp is regenerative farming. They is us, and we is them," he says. I'll put a link to the Common Ground website on the show page for this episode, and you can see when it's coming to your neck of the woods. This episode is brought to you in part by Impactful Ventures, an investment and incubation company focused on supporting startups and other initiatives that play a vital role in reversing the adverse effects of climate change. They strive to amplify enterprises which bring innovative green opportunities to the forefront and empower those making a significant impact for a sustainable future. You can learn more at impactfulventures.org. Okay, welcome back. I've got a few nuggets of hemp news for you this week. It's the middle of October 2023 for those of you keeping track at home. All right, first we're going to go up to Alaska, where Alaska Business Magazine is reporting that the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, the DNR, on October 5th released updated regulations that open the door for industrial hemp production in Alaska and create a state-directed endorsement program through which industrial hemp products can be made and sold in Alaska. With updated regulations for the Alaska Industrial Hemp Program, the state takes on primary authority over regulation and production from the USDA, simplifying the application and registration process and expressly prohibiting the sale of hemp products containing Delta-9 THC or non-naturally occurring cannabinoids. These revised industrial hemp rules increase safety for Alaskan children and protections for the regulated cannabis industry in our state, says DNR Commissioner John Boyle. The industrial hemp program was never intended to allow intoxicating products, which are rightfully regulated for the recreational market in Alaska by the Alcohol and Marijuana Control Office. These new regulations go into effect November 3rd. Now, the Anchorage Daily News is reporting that some hemp businesses are opposed to this change, and they say that Alaska's marijuana industry is more interested in extinguishing a competitor. Their interest isn't about protecting the children, it's about protecting their dollars, says Danny Ferguson of Anchorage-based Primo, Alaska. "I have well over 13,000 hemp-derived edibles in stock at my store, and I have no way to sell them in Alaska before November 3rd, he said. Yikes. Okay, now we head to Minnesota just to take note that the folks at the Lower Sioux Indian community are getting so much positive feedback for their work with hempcrete. Here's a story from KVRR.com. It says that crews on the Lower Sioux Indian Reservation are using industrial hemp to build new housing. Project manager Danny Desjarlais said a product called hempcrete replaces insulation and drywall during construction. It's just a lime-based binder mixed with some hemp hurd, he said. The inside woody core of the stock looks like little pieces of wood chips. You add some water in with that, and that's your mixture. Desjarlais said hempcrete is more widely used now thanks to the 2018 Farm Bill. With hemp being illegal here in the United States, we weren't able to use hempcrete, Desjarlais said. Even now, with the building codes in the U.S., hempcrete is just getting into the building codes for wall insulation. Desjarlais said using hempcrete makes the walls mold, fire, and pest resistant and will last hundreds of years. 2 duplexes are nearly complete, and a tiny home is also under construction on the Lower Sioux Indian Reservation. Occupants move into the Lower Sioux community's first hempcrete home in December. All right, and finally, here's a nugget of hemp news from the Chicago Sun-Times. The headline reads, "This is the future. New natural building material made of hemp could help Illinois and the U.S. go green." I'm just going to read you the beginning of this pretty long story. It says, as a mason with asthma and bronchitis, every time Larry Hill buys a new building, he has to tear out and redo the interior. "I don't know what's in there. I can't breathe in there. A lot of these houses got so much mold and stuff in there," he said. After spending the last 4 days at a green building workshop learning about hempcrete, Hill wants to begin using the natural, non-toxic building material, starting with a garage he's building at his house. Hempcrete is a breathable, sustainable building material made from the woody interior of the hemp stalk. Unlike modern concrete, hempcrete is modeled off ancient Roman concrete. Rather than increasing carbon emissions, hempcrete pulls it from the atmosphere. "I think this is the future. It's historical. I mean, they did it years and years ago," Hill said. "It's like lost and come back." About 50 investors, students, architects, workers in the trades, and farmers participated in a multi-day workshop focusing on the uses of hemp as an industrial product. The Building Green Hempcrete Workshop, led by Chicago-based Pink Hats Construction and Development Group and Toronto-based 1111 Farms, had more than a dozen sponsors from around the continent. All right, so I'll put links up to these stories so you can go and read them yourself. All right, so that's it for the news this week. Now let's move on to my conversation with Dr. David Suchoff. Our guest today is alternative crop professor in the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences at North Carolina State University, David Suchoff. Welcome to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Eric. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Yeah. I'm looking forward to the fall.
Amen.
Yeah.
It's been a hot summer, and it's finally starting to feel like fall here in North Carolina.
Good. Yeah, they said this was, the hottest summer on record, but it possibly the coldest summer of the rest of our lives.
Yeah. God, isn't that something? Yeah, it was brutal. We do a lot of field work, and there are a couple of days where it was just awful.
Yeah. Well, we'll try not to dwell on the negative here, but yes. Anyway, yes. So I know you by name and reputation. I'm not sure our paths have ever crossed before, but it's an honor to talk to you here today. So thank you.
Oh, likewise. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So first, can you briefly describe your role at NC State?
Sure. So I am an assistant professor and an extension specialist. And as you mentioned earlier, I lead the alternative crops program. So this position in alternative crops is actually a new one at NC State. And so I started with it roughly 5 years ago. And really, the reason for the development of this position is that farmers in North Carolina, just like farmers across the nation, are kind of always looking for new alternative crops. And I think especially here in North Carolina, where you and your listeners probably know tobacco has been our most important crop, but that market has changed and continues to change. And so farmers are seeking alternatives. And prior to my position, what was kind of going on is that faculty who have other responsibilities, so our small grain specialists, our tobacco specialists, or others, were also kind of tasked with kind of doing some work in alternative crops, but really, they've got their own day job. And so it got to a point where the college realized we need to create a specific position. And so what we do in my program is applied field research. We want to first determine, can we grow these alternative crops? And then if we can, what are some of the challenges that farmers face or questions we know farmers are going to ask, right? So which variety do I plant? How do I fertilize it? When do I harvest it? So the types of crops that we work with, hemp is one that we've been doing a lot of research and extension with since the beginning. We're doing a lot more work now with sesame. We do a little bit with organic sunflowers, and there are a few others that we dabble with.
Okay. So how or why did you first get into hemp?
So, hemp was already being grown in North Carolina prior to me coming on. And it was one of those crops that the other researchers who have their other jobs were having to do a little bit of work with, because the farmers they were working with were also growing hemp. So, for example, our tobacco specialist was doing a little bit of work with hemp. Our small grain specialist was doing a little bit of work with hemp. And we knew that it was going to be a crop that I would be working with when I started, just because of the sheer number of farmers that were growing it in our state. Now, that certainly shifted in terms of the type of hemp that's being grown and the questions that our farmers have, but it still makes up probably the majority. I shouldn't say the majority, but the larger percentage of the type of work that we do.
Okay. Is there a formal, hemp degree program at NC State?
There's not. So, my position is teaching and research and extension. I don't have any formal teaching appointment. I give guest lectures. We've toyed with the idea of at least having a course or two. I know that when you kind of look around the nation, you're starting to see more institutions putting maybe not necessarily a complete degree, but at least a couple of courses, because hemp and cannabis are, a part of our daily lives now. And we need to ensure that if students, especially students in agriculture that are interested in hemp or cannabis, we want to be able to give them at least a broader perspective and a more in-depth education. So we're toying with it. No, there's no formal degree, but I do have a lot of graduate students in my program who are doing research specifically in hemp. So I've had a number of students who have finished that did projects with floral hemp and fiber hemp, and a number of graduate students now who are mainly focusing on fiber hemp.
Okay. My next question was, what are the students most interested in? And then talk about some of the research that you're involved in.
Sure.
So go a little deeper in there.
Okay. Yeah. So, when we started off working with hemp, we were doing primarily floral hemp research. That's where the industry was. That's what our farmers were growing. And very well that the industry has shifted over time. And, we still have some floral hemp production in North Carolina, but it's not nearly what it was. But on the other side, we're seeing a tremendous growth and interest, both from our farmers and from industry in fiber hemp. And so we're really shifting with that to make sure that our work is applicable to our stakeholders, who are the farmers. So to give you an idea of some of the work that we're doing right now, we are doing a lot of work trying to, develop good production practices that our farmers can employ, but also how can we integrate more sustainable practices into the production of this crop, right? We want to ensure that as acreage increases, that farmers are employing these, sustainable or regenerative, whatever term you want to use, practices, such that this really is a climate smart crop. So for example, we are trying to determine what the optimal nitrogen rate is for fiber hemp. And what we're doing there is we're looking at different rates of nitrogen fertilizer, but we're also looking at incorporation of leguminous cover crops. So these are crops that fix nitrogen from the air. They more or less put it into the body of the cover crop. We then till that in and use that as a nitrogen source. Really trying to ask the question of, can we grow all of the nitrogen we need for this crop instead of having to purchase external inputs? Similarly, we're looking at weed management. With fiber hemp, we've seen that really one of the biggest challenges from an agronomic perspective is weed management, especially in the Southeast.
Yeah.
Did have a herbicide that was labeled, and many farmers are using it, but we also know that many farmers don't want to use herbicides. And similarly, there's still a lot of tillage of the soil prior to planting. And we know that when we talk about climate smart practices, tillage can really, really do a lot of harm to our ecosystems. It can really degrade our soil health. We can have a lot of greenhouse gases emitted during tillage. And so we're looking at trying to develop no-till systems where we are not tilling the soil, but instead we are growing a cover crop over the fall. We are rolling that down and leaving that on the soil as a mulch and then planting into that, such that the mulch acts as a weed barrier, but it still allows the hemp crop to come through. So we're doing some work there. We are doing a little bit more work now too in understanding what the optimal planting density is, right? We know that with fiber hemp, we want to put a lot of seeds out in the field so we can get that really nice thin stem. But when you ask different people, you get different numbers in terms of how many seeds per acre, how many pounds of seed per acre.
Right.
So we're doing density studies where we're planting 300,000, 600,000, 900,000, and so on plants per acre, and looking at how those populations affect stem diameter, bast yields, quality of the fiber, and so on.
And are you publishing that data?
It will be published, sure. Yeah. So this
Okay.
is the first year of those trials. So for a lot of the work we do, it's usually about 2 years. So we're going to do this research again next year. We do get that out both through our extension web portal. So we'll share that, for anyone who wants to see it, it's made public. And then of course, we'll publish that in scientific journals. The goal of this research is not to keep it, right? We're doing this so that we can get that information out so that folks can use it however they choose. Another area that we're focusing on is that we really want to look at how these different agronomic practices, whether it's fertility, harvest timing, variety selection, what does that mean for fiber quality? And here we're really tapping into our College of Textiles. So we are incredibly fortunate at NC State to have the Wilson College of Textiles, which is the only college of textiles in the nation. And I actually went on a tour of the College of Textiles yesterday with our FAR Hemp group. And I've gone on this tour many, many times. But each time I go, I learn something new about the work they do there. It is incredible what they're doing in that college. And we're kind of working with them and leveraging that resource such that we can answer not only the agronomic questions in terms of, we get the most yield here, the most bast here, but what does that mean when we talk about actual fiber quality so that we can have the whole story? When we're talking to farmers saying, hey, if you're growing for textiles, you want this density because it's going to give you this yield, but it's also going to result in this, type of fiber.
Right. Okay. Just sort of as a recap, what makes hemp a climate smart crop?
That's a great question. So what we've seen so far with hemp is that compared to many of our other, commodity crops, so corn, soybeans, wheat, it's relatively low input. What we're seeing so far is it doesn't appear to have a lot of fertilizer needs. It needs fertilizer, but probably roughly 90 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Potassium and phosphorus and some of the other nutrients are really going to depend a lot on your soil type and what you've been growing prior. Outside of weed management, here in North Carolina, at least, we don't see a lot of insect or disease pressure yet, knock on wood. And so we've not had to apply any insecticides or pesticides. I mentioned earlier that weeds are the biggest challenge. So there is the herbicide that folks are spraying, and we're trying to figure this all out. But from an input perspective, it's relatively low. The other one that comes up all the time is carbon, right? And I'll admit that there are some pretty big claims that are being made in the hemp realm that are not yet backed up by good data. Mm-hmm. Really, when we talk about carbon sequestration. And I think what happens is when you walk out to a field of fiber hemp, it is a tremendous field of biomass, right? And so people say, wow, there's so much carbon being sequestered. Yes and no. Yes, if we were to leave that in the field as is, but we always have to remember that this crop is destined to go into a product, right? And so it's really critical that we have more life cycle analyses, meaning from cradle to grave, from my seeds all the way to whatever product I'm making, I have a good accounting for the carbon. Because we got to remember, we're going to come in and we're going to cut that crop down. We're going to let it ret. We're going to bale it. We're going to decorticate it. We're going to degum it. All of these require energy, which means, there's probably CO2 that's being emitted. And then is that going into hempcrete or something that is more long-term, or is it going into paper or textiles that don't have quite that life cycle? So I guess, what I want to say is there certainly is potential, but I think we also have to be a little bit realistic and understand that we need more information, unfortunately, and really need to take a closer look at what the actual carbon sequestration capability of this crop is. That
Right.
being said, I think that there still is certainly huge potential in that realm for carbon sequestration, but we just have to be really smart about how we do it and how we quantify it.
Right. And which is, it shows how important the work that you and your fellow researchers are doing, because we need smart people to understand this. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I like to say is I've got great job security with hemp because there's so much work that needs to be done, right? I mean, yes, hemp is an ancient crop, but a lot of this we're kind of starting from scratch, and so there's just an endless number of questions that need to be answered.
Right. Yeah, and you never get a chance to like see an industry develop like this, right? There's so many, like amazing opportunities just waiting.
Absolutely. One thing I know some folks can be a little bit impatient with results, or they say, well, why aren't we here with this crop yet? And what I always like to remind them is that I've got a colleague who does corn research or wheat research. How long have we been growing corn and wheat, and we're still doing research on that crop? Whereas you think about hemp, I mean, how long has it been since we've been doing research? Not that long.
Not
So
that long.
I, I,
Not even
I
10
think
years.
exactly. I think in general, the amount of progress that we've had in the hemp industry, both from, just basic production, but also from a research side is tremendous. I mean,
Yeah.
really, really incredible.
Right. And looking at other crops, I was talking to Dr. Tony Brannon in Kentucky, and he was
Mhm.
telling me that when he was a little kid in the late 50s, early 60s, his grandparents grew soy, but as a forage crop. They didn't do anything with it. And then now, fast forward 50 years, and it's the second biggest crop in the world. So, yeah, things change, things take time, and yeah, patience.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. A few weeks ago, I spoke with Dr. Sahara Moon Chapotin. She's the executive director of FAR. And we talked about the Hemp Research Consortium. I know you're involved in that. Can you talk about your role in that consortium and the projects you're most excited about?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the director of the consortium, and you all know by now it's this public-private partnership, and we actually just had our annual meeting yesterday, and it was kind of a great refresher just to see the breadth and depth of the research that's going on. So when the consortium first started, as you probably would imagine, it was probably more heavily geared towards floral hemp because that's really where the industry was. We're now with the industry because this is really driven by the industry. We are seeing the consortium start to shift more towards kind of quote unquote industrial hemp, meaning grain, fiber, dual purpose. And so what I do in my capacity as the director is, I kind of help to organize the consortium for meetings like this. I'm actively meeting with more academic or I should say, potential academic and potential industry partners. One of the things that I always say is that the strength of the consortium lies in the diversity of its members, both our academic members and our industry members. So, we want hemp breeding companies, we want textile companies, we want grain companies. We want to bring as many people as possible into the consortium because the challenges that the hemp industry faces are complex, right? These are complex issues, just like the challenges that agriculture faces. And if we're really to affect change, we have to take a holistic approach to do that. And in order to have a holistic approach, we need to have as many voices at the table as possible. I also do research within the consortium as well, either as a lead PI on some projects or as a co-PI. So, for example, Dr. Larry Smart, who is a hemp breeder at Cornell. Cornell is part of the consortium. One of the projects that we've been working with Larry that is co-funded by International Hemp and FAR is developing more fiber and dual purpose hemp varieties that are a good fit, especially for the Southeast. One of the challenges that we've had in the Southeast, especially for fiber, is that our day lengths are different from where many of the genetics come from. So, a lot of the fiber varieties from France and Italy, Ukraine, they don't produce enough biomass down here. Our days are too short. And so Dr. Smart has been doing some work in developing some varieties that are a better fit for our region. And we're now in our second year of those trials, and the material is looking really, really excellent. So we're hopeful that within the next year or two, we're going to start to see those being commercially available to farmers, especially farmers that are looking for alternatives. We're going to be initiating a trial that I'm leading with a microbiologist here at NC State, a textile specialist in our College of Textiles, and researchers at Montana State University. And this is co-funded by IND Hemp, who I'm sure you all are very familiar with.
Yeah, they're actually one of our sponsors as well.
Yes, shout out to IND Hemp, and Bast Fibertech, who are a large degummer, and they have a new facility here in North Carolina. And there's two major goals with this project. The first is to try and get a better handle on retting. Retting is very much an art and a science. We know what's going on during retting, but we're really at the mercy of the environment. And one of the things that you always hear from apparel companies and textile companies is consistency. Consistency. That's what they're after with hemp. And it's a challenge because, cotton is a very consistent product, and hemp by nature is not. But there are things that we can do to try and make it a little bit more uniform. And so what we're looking for there is to try to more or less develop a probiotic. That is, look at what are the microbes that are associated with retting and breaking down the pectin. And is there something that we can develop that we can apply to the crop when we're cutting it so that we can get a more efficient retting process? So that's one aspect of the study. And then another one is to look at the effective harvest timing. And what does that mean for fiber quality? We know that fibers change over time. They can get thicker, they can get longer. But when do we really need to harvest that fiber for nonwovens or for textiles so that we can develop recommendations to farmers? So if for whatever reason a farmer can't get into the field when they really wanted to and have to harvest a little bit later, what is the best product that crop can go into? Or if they have to harvest a little bit earlier, where should that go? Should that go to textiles? Should that go to nonwovens, and so on? So that's a project that we're going to be initiating soon through the consortium, and we're quite excited about it.
Okay, great. So I understand that you were in the Peace Corps and you worked in Paraguay and Costa Rica. How does your time in the Peace Corps inform what you're doing now at NC State?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I did my 2 years in Paraguay, and then I extended for a third year in Costa Rica. And I'll admit, the Peace Corps really did lead me into my life in agriculture. What surprises a lot of people is that I didn't study agriculture in undergrad. I was actually a music major in college. So I was a music major, chem minor. It was a weird mix. And I knew I didn't want to go into music. I knew I didn't want to go into chemistry. I'd always gardened and loved plants, but never really thought that it would be kind of where I would go in life. And I went and met with a Peace Corps recruiter, and we got to talking, and they asked you all kinds of questions, what are your hobbies and so on. And gardening came up, and they said, we're actually looking for ag volunteers. And I thought, well, I don't really have experience for it. And they said, don't worry about it. You go through 3 months of intensive training, so on and so forth. And I just fell in love. I was living in a very small farming community, doing everything from incorporation of sustainable practices like cover cropping and crop rotation work that we're doing still here in the U.S., to working with families to kind of enhance their diet, get more fruits and vegetables into their diets and establish home gardens. And I think what my experience in the Peace Corps helped me learn about myself was, as I mentioned, I really, really love working with plants. I love working with agriculture. And I really like to work with farmers and farm families and do what I can do in my capacity, because I'm not a farmer, right? I did not grow up as a farmer, but, what is it that I can do in my capacity to help them to, really meet their goals and help to empower them?
Yeah, great. All right. So North Carolina and maybe the Southeast in general, and I know we sort of touched on this a little bit, it's sort of been cultivating this reputation for being the textile hub when it comes to hemp in the U.S., with folks like Eric Henry at TS Designs, Guy Carpenter, Bear Fiber, the guys at FiberX, and then you mentioned another company that set up a degumming facility. Can you talk about why the South is sort of the ideal place for hemp textiles and what issues in the supply chain need to be addressed before the region can reach its potential?
Sure. I think a lot of it is actually historical. So North Carolina, historically has been the hub of textiles, and it still is. There's been a tremendous amount of offshoring. But I read a statistic the other day that North Carolina houses 25% of the nation's textile industries. So it still is a very important textiles state. Granted, it's not what it used to be, but there still is a lot of interest. The other thing that I find exciting is that the fiber hemp itself seems to kind of be energizing a lot of these textile companies. They're getting really excited about hemp. They like the sustainability story that's associated with hemp and incorporating it into whatever piece of apparel or textile or non-woven product is. So I think having that foundation of just this historical textiles industry in the nation, or excuse me, in the state in the Southeast, has led more towards fiber hemp making a bit more sense here. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that it couldn't work. And I know that there are other states where they're doing some tremendous work. And I've seen some beautiful pictures of great crops being produced for fiber. But I think one of the things that we're really trying to focus on in the Southeast is to have these circular economies where we're growing the crop, we're processing the crop, and then we're actually incorporating it into whatever end use product it's destined to be in, all within either the state or within, a 200, 300 mile radius, which, I mean, for any crop, that's a really beautiful story. Yeah. Because, we're talking about really local production and what that means for local economies. So there's that story with the Southeast. Now, we're still not quite there yet. And you kind of brought this up. The challenge that we've faced with this crop is the challenge that we faced with fiber hemp since the beginning. And it's this chicken and egg issue where, end use manufacturers say, yes, we would love to incorporate fiber hemp into our product, but we don't see enough acreage, or, there's not enough of it out there right now. And we're not really willing to invest in, say, processing facilities because nobody's growing it. And then the farmer will say, well, I'd be happy to grow it, but I've got nowhere to sell it. I've got nowhere to process it. We are seeing a shift. We're finally starting to see more, decorticators popping up. Bast Fiber Tech, who I mentioned earlier, very, very large degummer. So we are starting to see those processing facilities open up, but we are nowhere near the numbers that we would need for this crop to really take off and be a much more commonly grown crop here in the Southeast, or really anywhere in the nation. This is not a crop that in the long term, when you talk about profits, that we're going to, produce in one part of the nation, process it, and then ship it, to the other part of the country to be degummed. The economics don't work out that way. Think a lot more like cotton. Cotton is very localized. You've got cotton gins in every county in North Carolina, just about every county, right? So it has to be much more local. Granted, it's going to take time, and I think people realize that, but it is moving in that direction.
Okay. You mentioned decorticators. Can you tell me about that custom decorticator that you had built there at NC State?
So I get questions about that thing all the time. And first off, big shout out to our Department of Bio and Ag Engineering. They're the ones that actually fabricated it. And it really came about because we said, hey, we're growing this crop, but we also want to decorticate, right? We need to, in terms of the data that we want to get out to folks, we don't want to just talk about straw yields. We want to talk about bast yields. And so they built this small little decorticator for us, and it served its purpose to a degree. But at the end of the day, it really, for what we wanted to do, it just didn't quite work. Okay. And so unfortunately, we've since had to take it apart and use the parts elsewhere. But we recently purchased a 16 roller decorticator through Conda Hemp. So it was shipped over from China. We're still finishing up with adding some safety to it so that students can use it safely whenever. But really, our program kind of outgrew that okay. Little decorticator that our Department of BAE had developed. But okay. I get questions about that thing all the time.
Yeah.
And the one thing I'll tell folks that are listening, because I have had this question a lot, and what I want to let them know is that for what we do in research, where we're harvesting small plots, and even then it's like maybe square meters worth of material, it was okay. Even then it was a bit cumbersome. But if you're a farmer, it's nowhere near the capacity that you would need. Even a small scale farmer, you would need a much larger piece of machinery to do, kind of your own custom decortication.
Right, right. But I love that. It's kind of like emblematic of, I don't know, the spirit in the industry. Like, oh, we have this problem. We want to solve it. We're going to do it. We got it done. And you learn, and then you grow, and you learn some more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what about grain hemp? Are there grain variety genetics that work in the South?
Yeah. So admittedly, we don't do a lot of grain research here at NC State. We've got a couple of dual purpose varieties in our variety trial, so we're looking at that. And there's a couple of reasons why we aren't really doing a lot of grain work at this point. I mean, the first is the fact that, fiber seems to really dominate the landscape, so to speak, in terms of interest from farmers and really what processors are looking to purchase. We can grow grain pretty well here. The varieties that are available do work well, but there's a couple of challenges. The first is insects and diseases. So, the Southeast is hot and humid, and the same challenges that we had with floral hemp, carry over to grain, in that we'll see diseases in those flower heads. They're very dense, and so with all of the rain and moisture we get, you get a lot of mold, and that affects the grain and the quality. Whereas you don't quite see as much of that out west, where it's much drier. So we don't have any products that we can apply that are really effective in managing those diseases. We also have corn earworms, which they love hemp flowers. They can devastate the crop. And then there's really not a big purchaser right now in North Carolina for grain. I will tell you, we have a huge animal industry in North Carolina, right? Big poultry industry, big swine industry. Me personally, I would love to see more hemp feed for animals. I know it is a very good nutrient source for poultry and livestock, but unfortunately, we can't do that.
Right. It's illegal.
It is illegal, which is, I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's very frustrating, right? I do think that eventually that will change. The Hemp Feed Coalition is doing tremendous work there.
Absolutely.
There's more and more research coming out showing, what this hemp seed can do for animals in terms of, the omega-3s in eggs and the health of the birds. So I think it's inevitable. Once that shifts, I do think we'll see a lot more grain production in the Southeast, because as it is, we're already importing a lot of grain to feed these animals. And so anything that we could do to produce more locally not only helps the farmers who are growing it, but it also helps the industry, the poultry or whatever livestock industry that we have.
Right. Okay. Do you have a vision of what the hemp industry can or will be like in 10 years?
Oh, wow. Oh, that's a tough one. I'll say no, to play it safe. Look, the hemp industry, and you know this better than anyone, the hemp industry moves very, very quickly, right? Had you asked me this 5 years ago, I would have said, we're going to see floral hemp everywhere. And, it's just going to be dominating the landscape. And that's changed tremendously. I'd like to say that at least here in North Carolina, we're going to see a lot more fiber. I'm hopeful that in 10 years, we'll be able to feed hemp and hemp products to animals. So we're going to see a diverse landscape. And that's actually something that kind of generally what we want to see through our program, where we work with new and emerging crops. We want to see a continual increase in crop diversity, whether it be hemp or sesame or any other crop. But we've got growers that are producing grain, or they're producing fiber, or dual purpose. I think dual purpose I think when we think about the economics of hemp, dual purpose is really going to be very important, where we can get grain, we can get fiber. We understand that maybe the fiber quality from a dual purpose won't be perfect for high quality textiles, but it's got hundreds of other applications, right? And so I think that we're going to see a lot more dual purpose starting to pop its head up. And who knows?
Right. Okay. All right. Is there a way to harness the marijuana stigma so that it works for hemp rather than against it?
Ooh, that is a good question. I don't know. That it's hard. And I say that I'd have to think about that question a little bit more, but I think the challenge that hemp does have is the stigma that's still associated with it. When I talk to people about hemp, and you've probably heard this too, when you talk about like, oh, this shirt was made from hemp or this whatever was made from hemp, someone inevitably will say, well, can you smoke it? Right? It's just like, come on,
Yeah.
and there it's really just education, right? And I think that that's something that all of us can do to better educate folks, talk about what hemp is not. I think if anything, we can continue to learn from the marijuana industry in general, right? We see what's going on in other states where they have recreational marijuana and understand what that might mean for the hemp industry. I think we're seeing a lot of similarities. When you read in the news about what's going on with marijuana, there's a lot of overproduction. And that kind of happened with floral hemp too. And I think that folks did learn from that, especially floral hemp producers. We're not seeing quite as many people jump into fiber hemp as we did with floral hemp. And I think that's also because some folks got burned from floral hemp, but they also realized like, hey, I shouldn't just jump into this because I saw what happened with floral hemp, or I'm seeing what's happening with the marijuana industry. Let's kind of take this a little bit slower. So I think we can certainly learn from marijuana in that aspect. But look, I think people's views on marijuana continue to change, right? I think it's more accepted by a larger percentage of the population each year. And people are realizing that the sky's not falling in these states that have legalized marijuana. Sure, it's got its issues, but so does the alcohol industry, right? I mean, everyone's got their own issues, but I think folks are opening their eyes. And my hope is that maybe someone that was interested in marijuana learns a little bit about hemp and they get really excited about hemp, right? The application.
I've seen that happen so many times, actually. It's
exactly. So inspiring. That's kind of my hope, at least.
Okay. All right. So one final question. You mentioned you were a chemistry and music major in undergrad. So what role does music play in your life now?
Oh, good question. So I don't really play anymore. I'll admit, I played the trumpet and I still have it. I think about tooting my horn every now and then, but at the end of the day, when I'm tired, it's like, do I really want to pick that up? I love music. I listen to music almost constantly, and it's a pretty diverse mix from classical, which is what I'm trained in, to all kinds of random stuff. So I listen to a lot of music. We do a lot of driving for my program around the state, and so usually instead of podcasts, sorry, Eric, I generally listen to music. Though maybe I'll start putting this one on instead. So I listen to a lot of music. One thing though that I think I benefited from music is you have to stand and perform, right? I had to get up in front of large crowds, and even though I was nervous, I stood up there and I performed. And I try to take that into when I give a presentation or when I give a class, right? It's all a performance. You've got to stand up there. If you're nervous, fake it. But really kind of this understanding of, I need to be up there and give a performance. And I think that I've certainly benefited from that. And that's something that I'm trying to work on with students, right? Talking about, all right, you've got to give this presentation to farmers or to a scientific community. Let's talk about your posture. Let's talk about how you present yourself. And there's a tremendous amount of carryover from music performance into, presenting your research at a scientific conference.
Awesome. Dr. David Suchoff, thank you so much. It's a pleasure talking to you today.
Oh, likewise, Eric. Thank you so much.
All right. Just like that, the show comes to an end. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you want to click on some links that take you to the work that Dr. Suchoff is doing down there at NC State or with the Hemp Research Consortium, check us out at lancasterfarming.com. I'll have links on the show page for this episode. Anyway, my name is Eric Herlock. I am the digital editor here at Lancaster Farming Newspaper, the greatest agricultural newspaper in the world. But don't just take my word for it. Check it out yourself. Go get a subscription. See what we have to offer. You will not be disappointed. Anyway, if you want to get in touch with me, the best way is by email. Send it to podcast@lancasterfarming.com. You can also check out our things on LinkedIn and Instagram. And I'm trying to do a better job of sharing things on the social media. But whatever. Anyway, so thanks again for listening. Until next time, I'll see you in the newspaper.
industrial hemp.
Season 3, Episode 38 of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2023 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show is written and recorded, edited and produced by Eric Herlock, and the music you hear throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.